By the time I arrived at the Ashford family anniversary dinner, I already knew something was wrong, because my Aunt Celeste had spent 3 weeks asking me to cover small expenses that somehow kept becoming larger, while my older brother Marcus and his wife, Lillian, treated my help as though it were an obligation rather than a choice. And I had finally reached the point where every request sounded less like family asking for support and more like an invoice with my name already printed at the bottom. Still, I walked into the grand dining hall with a carefully wrapped gift in my hands, wearing a simple emerald dress, and telling myself that perhaps this time they would remember that I was a person before they remembered that I was financially dependable. The room was filled with relatives, old family friends, business acquaintances, and strangers I had never met. And as I looked around at the expensive flowers, towering candles, musicians, and champagne fountain, I realized that nearly everything I was seeing had been paid for through transfers I had made over the previous month, yet my name appeared nowhere on the invitation, the program, or the welcome board beside the entrance. I had been raised to believe that keeping peace was a form of love, so for years I swallowed every insult and answered every request with the same tired phrase, "I'll take care of it," even when I was secretly wondering why the people who praised my independence were always the first to depend on me. I had paid Marcus's professional certification fees when he was struggling, helped Celeste repair her house after a storm, covered medical bills for relatives who promised to repay me, and once even rescued a family business from a disastrous supplier contract because everyone insisted I was the only person capable of fixing it. But that evening, as I stood near the back of the hall, a waiter mistakenly handed me a tray and asked whether I could help arrange the dessert table. And when I politely explained that I was a guest, he looked embarrassed and apologized, which somehow hurt more than I expected because it confirmed something I had been trying not to admit. My own family had trained everyone around them to see me as the person who worked quietly in the background while others received the applause. The real humiliation came during the speeches, when Celeste stepped onto the small stage and raised her glass with a theatrical smile, thanking everyone who had made this celebration possible, nomming sponsors, decorators, musicians, and even a distant cousin who had donated a few bottles of wine, while completely skipping over the person who had paid the largest portion of the event. Then she laughed and said, "Well, at least we know we can always count on Nora when the bill arrives." And several people laughed because they assumed it was harmless family teasing, while Marcus lowered his head and smiled instead of defending me, and Lillian glanced toward me with an expression that seemed almost apologetic but never became an apology. I felt my face grow warm, but I refused to give them the reaction they expected, because suddenly I remembered every late-night phone call, every emergency transfer, every promise that this is the last time, and every moment when I had convinced myself that generosity would eventually earn me respect. Instead of confronting them immediately, I quietly returned to my seat and opened the Notes app on my phone, where I began listing every contribution I could remember, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to know exactly how much of my life had been converted into favors that everyone else now considered normal. By the time the main course arrived, the total had climbed far beyond what I had imagined, and the number on my screen made my stomach tighten because it represented years of postponing my own plans so other people could live theirs without consequences. When Marcus finally came over, he leaned against the table and whispered, "Please don't make tonight difficult." And I looked up at him and asked, "Was I difficult when you needed help?" Before adding, "Was I difficult when Mom needed surgery, when the roof collapsed, or when you couldn't make your payments?" He stared at me for several seconds before saying, "That's different," and I answered, "No, Marcus, the only difference is that I finally noticed the pattern." Next morning, I contacted my financial advisor, Helena, a woman who had warned me more than once that my family contributions were becoming impossible to distinguish from permanent financial commitments, and I asked her to review every account connected to family expenses. She discovered that several payments I thought were temporary had been structured in ways that allowed other relatives to treat them as ongoing support, and there was even a shared family fund that Marcus had assumed would continue receiving automatic contributions from me. Helena looked over the documents and said quietly, You don't have a money problem, Nora. You have a boundary problem. And for the first time, I didn't argue with her. That afternoon, I canceled the automatic transfers, removed my payment information from every vendor account I could identify, and sent one short message to the family group. Effective immediately, I will no longer be responsible for expenses that are not mine. Reaction was immediate and astonishing, because within 20 minutes Celeste called me accusing me of embarrassing the family. Marcus demanded to know how he was supposed to cover the remaining event expenses, and Lillian sent a message saying, "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." I stared at that sentence for nearly a minute because I couldn't remember what they had ever done for me financially, emotionally, or practically that came close to what they were demanding. Instead of arguing, I replied, "Please send me a list of what you believe I owe you," and then I turned off my phone. No list ever arrived because the truth was simpler than their accusations. They had become accustomed to my generosity, and when generosity disappeared, they mistook the loss of access for betrayal. 3 days later, Marcus appeared outside my apartment carrying a folder filled with unpaid invoices, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his expression rather than entitlement. He told me the family had promised several vendors that I would handle the remaining balances, and I calmly explained that no one had the authority to make promises using my name. He lowered himself into the chair across from me and said, "I thought you wanted to be needed." And I replied, "I wanted to be loved, Marcus. Those are not the same thing." He looked away, and after a long silence he admitted that Celeste had always told him I preferred staying behind the scenes because I didn't like attention. But I finally understood that my quiet personality had been turned into an excuse to erase me while still using everything I provided. The following week brought the discovery that changed everything. Because Helena found an old business agreement connected to a property my parents had placed into a family trust years earlier, and the documents showed that I had been contributing to maintenance and taxes while several relatives had been treating the property as though it belonged exclusively to them. When Celeste learned that I had requested an independent review, she accused me of threatening the family and insisted that the property was basically Marcus's. I answered, "Basically isn't a legal term," and requested that every future conversation about the property happen through the appropriate professionals. For once, there was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation, and no emotional speech. I simply stopped arguing and started documenting, because I had finally learned that facts could protect me in ways guilt never had. Months passed, and the family celebration that had once seemed like the center of everyone's world became an embarrassing memory they rarely mentioned, while I began rebuilding my own life around choices that didn't require anyone else's approval. I enrolled in a leadership program, traveled alone for the first time in years, and began developing a small foundation that helped young professionals learn financial independence, because I wanted the lessons I had learned painfully to become useful to someone else. Marcus eventually called and admitted that he had treated my reliability as something he was entitled to. And although I appreciated the honesty, I told him that forgiveness did not automatically mean returning to the old arrangement. "I don't need you to punish yourself," I said. "I need you to stop expecting me to rescue you." Never offered the apology I once imagined, but one evening I received an envelope from her containing an old photograph of the two of us standing beside a garden fence when I was a child, and on the back she had written only 3 words, "I remember you." I held the photograph for a long time, realizing that perhaps she did remember me, but remembering someone was not the same as respecting them, and I no longer needed to convince anyone that I deserved either. I placed the photograph in a drawer beside the first contract from my company, smiled at the strange symmetry of those 2 pieces of paper, and understood that my life had finally stopped being a waiting room for someone else's approval. A year after that dinner, I returned to the same city for a professional conference and passed the hotel where our family celebration had taken place. And for a moment I remembered the stage, the laughter, the uncomfortable silence, and the version of myself who had stood there wondering whether speaking up would make her a bad daughter or sister. Instead of feeling ashamed, I felt grateful to that woman because she had finally recognized that love without respect can become a cage. I kept walking, carrying nothing from that night except the lesson it had given me. You can spend years proving that you are generous, dependable, and loyal, but the people who truly value you will never require you to destroy yourself just to remain part of their lives. Today, I don't tell people that I stopped helping my family because I want sympathy, and I don't describe myself as the victim of some grand betrayal, because the most important part of my story isn't what they did to me, but what I finally learned to do for myself. I learned that saying no is not cruelty, leaving an unhealthy pattern is not abandonment, and protecting your future does not make you selfish. If someone only remembers your value when your wallet is open, let them experience the silence when it closes, because sometimes the strongest response isn't an argument, a public confrontation, or a dramatic goodbye. It is simply choosing a life where your worth is never measured by what you can pay. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.